those boundaries, and children who are easily bullied may also have a problem with hand supporting. The hand supporting reflex is also incredibly important for a later developing reflex that's referred to as the symmetric tonic neck reflex, where we get up on our hands and knees and so forth, and that's immensely important for crawling. So you can see how one reflex can link to many others. This one, of course, is something that we're all familiar with, and I mentioned before, this is the rooting reflex. It emerges very early, somewhere around 24 to 28 weeks in utero, and it's present for about 3 to 4 months of life. And this combination of the rooting and something called the Babkin reflex, which I'll show you on the next slide, and sucking are extremely important, especially in those first few hours after life, as Dr. Sears was mentioning, how that bonding really needs to take place, and that's what, that the opportunity to switch on these reflexes is extremely important in those first few hours, and especially that first hour, and that if the baby doesn't receive some gratification during this time, these reflexes will weaken. A persistent or an abnormal sucking response can be seen in children that have certain types of oral defensiveness. Some babies, for whatever reason, I happen to have a son who was suctioned at birth because he aspirated amniotic fluid, and he had a hard time learning how to suck and latch on after that because of the traumatic event. So sometimes things that are traumatizing to a child like that at birth that we normally wouldn't pay as much attention to can greatly affect the way those reflexes develop. And children that have trouble with food textures, kids with articulation problems, many of these kids may have trouble with the rooting, the sucking, or this next reflex called the Babkin. This is such a cute reflex. When you push in the middle of a baby's palm, they actually will open their mouth. And usually they'll turn their head to the side that you're pushing on. And if you stimulate both palms at the same time, they'll lean their head forward. And they believe that the Babkin palmamental reflex, we really feel that it is related to hand-to-mouth connections that have to do, with self-feeding later on. So children that have a retained Babkin palmamental may be a child who is constantly putting things in their mouth, like chewing on pencils and pencil erasers. They may be nail biters. They may be kids that are always chewing on the front of their shirt, which you probably have seen some of those children. And they always, very often, have to have things in their hands. They're the ones that always have to have that fidget toy. So, what's interesting is every time I go to a conference, I always meet people from all around the country and around the world of all different disciplines, which is really wonderful for me because I'm not just looking at this narrow ideological scope, but I'm really getting so many different perspectives. And when I listen to the occupational therapists and physical therapists who are at our conferences and they're introducing themselves and they're talking about why they're there, they all kind of sigh, and then you kind of see their eyes close for a moment as they take this breath and they say, all these years I've been working with these children and I've been teaching them to compensate around their reflexes, not realizing how much I was really draining their resources and making them so much less efficient. If I only knew that I could really learn how to integrate the resource, the reflex, and give them the correct sequence so that they could move on in a hierarchical progression. So the reflexes are hugely important for higher order development. And here's another reflex that is probably very familiar to you. It's called the Mnri. The Mnri is extremely important for our children that have autism because many of our children have a retained Mnri and they are stimulus bound. The Mnri is connected to almost every other sense. So you can trigger a Mnri by some sort of a visual stimulation. You can trigger it auditorily by a loud sound. Or if you drop the head back and the baby feels like it's falling, you'll see this Mnri response. And what happens is the baby immediately takes a huge breath and freezes, and then it exhales and it clasps forward. And the Mnri is really important for activating that first breath of life. When babies come out and that head is tilted back, one of the things that's happening is that Mnri reflex. These primitive primary motor responses actually help us in that whole birth process all along the way. When the marrow is retained, it causes the child to release stress hormones. And as you know, stress hormones can affect a child's immunity. So if you have a child who's just stimulus bound and everything is putting them into marrow, their poor little system is constantly secreting adrenaline and cortisol, which these hormones that we know that they weaken the immune system. So they become stimulus bound, as I mentioned, and their whole emotional profile becomes wrapped up in this marrow response. And we also have the opposite side of that coin, where we have children who have a hypoactive marrow response, and they're sort of catatonic, and certain things that should trigger fear or a marrow response don't. The beautiful thing about Mascotova is that whether you have a hyperactive response or a hypo-underactive response, you give the same stimulus, you give the same treatment program, and either way it will either bring on the reflex or it will help integrate the reflex. The reflexes actually have kind of a lifespan where they peak and then they wane. Some of our children really haven't even developed their reflexes properly for one reason or another. So first we have to encourage it to even evolve and get that reflex switched on, and then we can work on the integration part of that. Here's a slide that's showing, it's taken from Sally Goddard's book, Reflexes, Learning, and Behavior, which I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. That was a good one when I was first starting to get into the reflex work, to get more information, to give me more background on the reflexes. I'll show you that resource again in just a moment. But the interesting thing with this slide is that you can see that the vertical line there has actually a B at the top. That means birth. That's when a child is born. And the reflexes that are shown on the left-hand side, don't preoccupy yourself so much with the names of those reflexes, but I want you to see that those are the primary motor responses that are developing as early as 2 months of age. At 8 weeks, when that fetus is just kind of like a little worm, so to speak, already we're starting to see evidence of a marrow reflex in that baby. And then when the baby is born, then the reflexes start to integrate. The reflexes at the bottom are more of our postural reflexes that are going to emerge later on, and many of those will be with us throughout life. But notice in this graph that most of these reflexes actually integrate by 6 months of age. So when these reflexes are still evident by 12 months of age, we're all starting to scratch our heads going, I wonder if this child is at risk for neurodevelopmental problems. So by 6 months of age, those first 6 months of life are really, really critical for us to recognize that these children are perhaps going to be heading down the wrong path. And the earlier we can do something about it, well, hopefully the better our outcome's going to be. I always say it's more difficult to unlearn and relearn. So in other words, when a child develops all kinds of abnormal, aberrant types of responses around a particular reflex, then I want to go back and reestablish that reflex. They're going to have to unlearn those compensatory behaviors. It would have been so much easier if I just knew in the beginning how to get that reflex switched on and how to work through it. So as an audiologist, I'm going to put my audiology hat on from time to time. We test babies at birth, all babies that are admitted to hospitals in most states of the United States, it may be all now. They have a hearing test on the way out, some kind of auditory evoked potential or something called an otoacoustic emission. And we know that if we don't diagnose babies by 3 months of age, and if we don't get hearing aids on them by 6 months of age if they're hearing impaired, that they're always going to be behind their peers in terms of their language development. So I thought, isn't that interesting how the timelines seem to coincide, that we have to get hearing aids on these kids by 6 months or they're never going to catch up. And I've had so many instances where I found children at 2, 3 years of age and they're hearing impaired. 18 months even is a little on the late side, and I put hearing aids on them, and if you think about it, all their reflexes, they've already emerged, and the hearing system has been left out of the whole mix. And now I'm going to try to put hearing back into the mix, but the system has already woven itself together. I always think of it like a football team, and everybody